Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You know the phrase by now. It's uttered by everyone, from politicians who are after your vote, to your fellow citizens suffering from sheer frustration, or even just comics looking for a laugh.
After 9 years of this prime minister, everything is broken.
Everything's broken.
Everything feels broken. Everything feels broken.
But when he says that Canada is broken, that's where we draw the line.
In the ERs that remain open, wait times have never been longer.
It may seem like there's a lot of places to shop in Canada, but all these stores are owned by just 3 big companies.
There's extreme partisanship and extreme polarization.
A new poll says that the majority of Canadians feel that Canada is broken. What? Just because the stock market is down, the railroad is on fire, and the Leafs lost to a Zamboni driver?
We're going to let Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre argue over if this country is entirely broken or not. But as we cover the news in Canada, it has become very clear to us here at The Big Story that some of the systems we rely on are faltering, to say the least. And rather than use that to try and grab some downloads or score a few political points, we thought we'd ask some of the smartest people in their respective fields a few simple questions. Starting with this: is it broken? If it is, how do we fix it? Welcome to Fixing Canada, a special series running all this week on The Big Story. Today, we tackle competition, or rather we tackle Canada's lack of it. If you've paid attention to headlines or even just the world around you, you are probably well aware of our government's desire to bring in more grocery retailers, or you might have noticed consolidation in some high-profile sectors. But the problem goes beyond that. Right now, competition is vanishing in sectors from medical technology to funeral services and even to veterinarians. And politicians from every major party recognize this as a problem that leads to stagnation and often to higher prices for consumers. So how do we solve it? Well, the good news is that we actually do have the tools. In fact, in the past year alone, we have created better tools to tackle this problem. The question, as it is so often, is if this government, or the next one, will have the conviction to actually use them to their fullest extent. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is Fixing Canada on The Big Story. Vas Bednar is the Executive Director in the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster University, a favorite guest of ours. Hi, Vas.
Hey, Jordan.
And Denise Hearn is a Resident Senior Fellow at Columbia's Center of Sustainable Investment. Hello, Denise.
Hi, Jordan.
Together, this is why we're talking to them at the same time, they have a book on this exact subject coming out. It is called The Big Fix: How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. And it arrives October 15th. So, this is perfectly timed for us. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Either one of you can take this because it's a well-known meme at this point that Canada is like 3 or 6 companies in a trench coat. How true is that joke?
I mean, I feel like there's some truth to the joke in that it persists, or we're sort of comforted by it, but maybe it's worth asking, like, sure, the number in the trench coat keeps changing, but kind of why does it persist, right? And it persists because Canadians feel or seem to feel kind of stuck or constrained, that they don't have enough choice, and that certain companies have come to dominate or characterize certain sectors. So I think that's why the meme persists in the trench coat. I don't know if you hear it trickle over to the U.S., Denise.
I don't think we have the same one in the U.S. And I think in Canada, it tends to conjure the conversation around the well-known oligopolists, the telcos or the grocers or the airlines or the banks. And what we're hoping to do in our book is to also demonstrate that this kind of industry consolidation that is well known in certain sectors is actually much more pervasive than people realize, and in a lot of areas that are hidden to us. And so there's many more trench coats, perhaps,
yes,
than previously understood. And what policy tools and levers do we actually have to sort of rebalance the power across the economy so that it works better for different stakeholders, not only consumers, but workers and independent businesses too.
That's great. And that's what I want to talk about today, because this whole week is about actually fixing the problems, not just, as we've often done on this show, diagnosing them again and again. But maybe first, just to set the tone, and because I'm curious, do we have any tangible way to measure how much competition Canadians have in their choices compared to, say, the United States or other countries?
Yeah, so I think there are many ways of thinking about this question. It's a really interesting one. And you can certainly look at how particular industries are concentrating, and then you can compare those, let's say in Canada versus the US. So you might look at, okay, how concentrated are the banks relative to the US? So you can do it on a sort of sector by sector basis. But often even those sectoral kind of measurements of competition don't really give us the full picture for a number of reasons. So one is you could have a local monopoly where even though maybe you have 4 or 5 major insurers in the US as an example, nationally, when you look regionally or locally, they might have local monopolies. And then the other reason why these market concentration measurements don't always give us the full picture is that one of the key points that Vas and I have been talking a lot about is that companies no longer just compete within one industry.
Right.
They really are trying to own assets across industries, right? And so when you look at something like TELUS, which traditionally we all think of as a telco company, has a health division. It has a subsidiary that does a lot of international business. They're quite active in agriculture and sort of digitization of all these different industries. So companies are changing. The way that we think about competition also has to sort of keep pace with those market changes and realities.
Whether it's a large market like groceries, which is one of the things that basically every Canadian would understand, or even a smaller market that we wouldn't typically think of having a monopoly situation in. I know this sounds like a simple question, but what do we know about what lack of competition actually does to a sector of industry?
The core concerns tend to be that there will be higher prices. So sometimes we see this trend where a dominant firm will kind of price discipline competitors, right, to kind of have them edge out of the market or pressure them to maybe be acquired or become a private label brand. And then once they have a particular share of the market, they're able to kind of have that price go up. People get concerned about reduced innovation, lower quality products or services. There's just not an incentive to do better, to be better.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, just laziness, right? Complacency, inefficiency across companies, high barriers to entry. So even for firms that want to try to come compete and shake things up, that they're just going to be disincentivized or turn away. That cost to them, financial and otherwise, is just way too high. Persistent economic inequality. And I think the language that we see more so in the US than in Canada really is around, freedom and liberty.
Mm-hmm.
So fundamentally, our ability to choose, to have choices, to have freedom and flexibility in our everyday lives just isn't there.
How easy or more likely difficult is it to go out and encourage competition in a key sector?
I mean, we have tons of policy tools, right, for smart policy. Sometimes the competition conversation, we reduce it a lot, right, where we sort of say, and part of our playfulness with the title of the big fix is that we have, some of these zombie ideas, I'll say, that persist, like that one simple fix we're looking for, right? We just need more foreign competition, or we just need to get rid of supply management, or we just need to reduce regulatory barriers and the economy is going to explode. To Denise's point, on a sector by sector basis, there may be different policy interventions that are necessary to level a playing field, to introduce more clarity, deal with power imbalances. But in terms of more, what does it mean to even want more competition?
Right.
I think we become a little bit obsessed with kind of counting the number of competitors in a particular space. But, more competition could also mean better competition.
Right.
Instead of more competitors in terms of the volume overall.
Well, I'll ask you, and I know I said I wasn't going to harp on the problem before we move to the solution, but I want to ask you, Denise, because Vas just mentioned it and you mentioned it earlier. I am one of those people that if you ask me to think about competition, I would think about groceries and telcos and that kind of stuff. So give me some examples of these smaller sectors that lack of competition can impact and how it does that.
Well, it's not just smaller sectors. So I actually just learned today that, as an example, TELUS Health and Express Scripts, which is a Canadian subsidiary of a U.S. company, control basically 80% of all private insurance claims in Canada. They operate what's known as pharmacy benefit managers. And so they sit as middlemen essentially between pharmacies and insurers, and they negotiate the rates whenever you file a drug claim. And they've been under huge scrutiny in the U.S. The Federal Trade Commission is investigating them right now and doing a big market study. And it's expected that they'll probably take some legal action against some of the large PBMs in the U.S. And in Canada, one of our primary providers is one of these U.S. PBMs. That's an interesting one. There's consolidation in the agricultural space. So Canada, we're the biggest potash provider globally. And we have one main company named Nutrien. And then there's sort of 3 or 4 fertilizer companies that have essentially an oligopoly on various types of fertilizer in Canada. We talk a lot about everything from eyewear, getting your sunglasses at the mall, to funeral services and funeral homes, which are increasingly getting bought up in what's called serial acquisitions, so roll-ups. Veterinary practices are experiencing this. So there's so many different industries where this consolidation is either has already long been underway or is, currently underway, that I think goes underappreciated often in the national conversations about this issue.
And part of why it ends up being a little bit underappreciated has to do with, again, the structure of these companies and how they communicate ownership. For instance, with something like private labels, which comes up in Canada, we have different brands, right? Different brand names, and people may not necessarily realize that this is owned by the very same company or store that they're shopping at. So there's this kind of dangerous illusion of rivalry that we allow to persist.
I want to hear more in a few minutes about some of the underappreciated ways that we could prevent those kind of roll-ups and acquisitions that turn a sector into a quasi-monopoly. But first, just because I think it's what almost everyone pictures when we talk about creating more competition, to use a grocery example in particular, there's been a lot of push, both from people in the government talking about it, but also just from average Canadians to say, let's go out and get another big grocery corporation to come here and compete with Loblaw and the rest. And I know it's not as easy as it sounds, but how likely is it we could even pull it off if we really wanted to?
Well, I think this gets to what Vas was talking about in terms of what is competition for and what do we want it to do for us? And this idea that just by bringing a foreign competitor that somehow magically solves the issues of higher prices for consumers, workers having to bargain against concentrated employers, which basically did wage fixing during the pandemic. They've been caught price fixing with bread and other things. And so does adding one more competitor, particularly a foreign-owned competitor, does that change those fundamental dynamics? And I think that is the second order question that really we need to get to as a country in our policy conversation, because competition policy, yes, it's about competition, but ultimately what it tries to do is understand power dynamics in markets, power asymmetries in markets between counterparties, between workers and companies, between consumers and companies. And those power asymmetries can look very different. It could be information asymmetries, like Vas was talking about, where we all think that there's a lot more competition that's for our dollars than there actually is. It could be that actually, if you're a small supplier and you're trying to get on the shelf of a grocery store, as Vas is talking about, you're competing directly with the retailer that is responsible for getting your product to market. You have to compete now with their private label brands that they give preferential treatment to. So those dynamics don't get fixed by just adding a competitor.
Right.
And so that's why you need a broader set of tools that really structurally analyzes how power manifests in each industry. What are the tactics that companies use to entrench themselves even further? And what are the regulatory and sort of legal tools that we have to actually rebalance these structures? And so one of the things in terms of grocery that we've talked about is in the US, there's something called the Robinson-Patman Act, which initially was meant to protect smaller grocers from concentrated suppliers. Now we're in the opposite situation where we have really concentrated grocers and diffuse suppliers often. But the point is that it tried to eliminate price discrimination so that essentially every supplier would get paid the same amount regardless of who's purchasing the product or how much product they're putting forward. And so we think that something like that would do a much better job of serving smaller suppliers' interests than necessarily adding a foreign competitor. That's one idea. It's very specific to grocery, but I think, again, what we're trying to emphasize is that we really have to get a lot more nuanced in terms of like what we want competition to do and what are the outcomes we want to see from that, and whose interests are we really trying to foreground, because, often there are trade-offs between different economic stakeholders, and we have to make those determinations about who we're trying to support with these policies.
That's the kind of solution that we want to discuss this week. But obviously, if it's going to require a nuanced approach, sector to sector, industry to industry, can you give me like a broad sketch of how you would set up policy tools that could be that nuanced? Because unless I'm wrong, right now we kind of have the Competition Bureau, which takes a very sort of, high-level, top-down approach to it. How could we do it differently?
I mean, there's lots we could do differently if we kind of took a more expansive view of whose responsibility thinking about competition and competitiveness is, right? Right now, we sort of think it's a little bit bonkers that we've tasked one part of a ministry, the very same ministry that thinks about innovation and how to grow companies, with kind of policing the economy. So one of the things we write about is, what does it look like for Canada to actually take a whole of government approach, to think more comprehensively about things like future policy decisions? What are the implications for the market that they're touching? Sometimes this means that we'd be backward looking. So, continuing work that's already ongoing in Canada, assessing kind of the regulatory barnacles we've inherited, right? Can we streamline, where can we find efficiencies? This is absolutely important, but it's not kind of the foundation that's going to change everything. Not to be, the boring researcher, but more research, right? More of a beat. I keep bringing up the US because Denise is US based and Canadian by birth, so she has this amazing vantage point, but we don't have even one reporter in Canada who is just on the competition beat, helping us tell these stories. And there's a lack of research, right? The same numbers kind of get cited all the time, and that's okay. The research that exists is of very high quality. But again, from a volume perspective and from our ability to appreciate how the country is changing, we definitely have blind spots there, and that needs to be solved going forward.
I would just add that, yes, this is like a complicated and complex area, and so it requires nuanced approaches like we're describing, but there's also long-standing policy tools like blocking mergers, and Canada has never successfully blocked a merger.
Really? Never?
Never. I think there was one time where they blocked it and then it got reversed upon appeal. And so we have the tools, we just have not used them. And I think these new legislative changes that have happened over the last year that were completely cross-party, the latest amendments were passed unanimously through Parliament, which is absolutely astounding and such a signal that this really matters to every constituency. And now that the Bureau has a strong legislative regime, which Canada had one of the weakest competition laws in the world, so that's huge.
Explain for those who haven't followed it, what has changed in terms of that over the past year.
So yeah, there's been a number of changes. I would say in terms of mergers, one of the biggest ones that's changed is we used to have something called the efficiencies defense, where firms could argue anytime they were merging or had a proposed merger, that as long as they were going to increase efficiencies and pass those cost savings from the efficiencies down to consumers, then they should be allowed to merge regardless of whether it massively increased concentration. And also the same thing for anti-competitive behavior. They argued that as long as there was efficiency, that they could act in anti-competitive ways. And so that made it very, very difficult for the Bureau to actually bring cases and succeed, because there was always this sort of exemption. And We got rid of that completely, which I think is fantastic. And we also shifted the burden of proof onto merging parties. So now there's a presumption that if a merger leads to, crosses a particular threshold of market concentration, there's a presumption that that is illegal. And it's now on the firms to prove that the benefits are going to outweigh the negative impacts of that. That kind of structural presumption, it sounds technical, but it's absolutely massive. And the hope is that this will help to prevent consolidation going forward. But there's a number of other things. The Bureau now has the ability to investigate companies and actually compel information. Before they weren't allowed to do that. So we have a lot more sort of tools now in the tool belt that we can deploy. And I think it is about getting the Bureau better funding, more funding so that they can actually use these tools. And then to Vass's point, it's not just about the Bureau. We also have to ensure that every ministry who knows their own sector inside and out starts thinking more strategically and more comprehensively about how competition and these kind of market power, market structure issues affect their industry and what tools they have to be able to regulate in a way that actually rebalances power across the economy.
Do you see signs from either the Bureau or the government, or I guess presumptively the next government in waiting, that there is a real desire to get tough on this, as opposed to putting the tools in place and just not using them too much, because these are, the 5 or 6 big companies that we have in this country, and we don't want to piss them off?
The government has sort of taken this approach of radical incrementalism.
Radical incrementalism sounds incredibly Canadian, by the way.
That's how I dress it up. You know what I mean? I try to make it more comprehensive. But this core debate that existed before, which was there were 2 camps really. And one camp sort of said the economy has changed, so our law needs to be modernized. And the other camp sort of said, actually, the law is amazing and infinitely flexible and can do so much. And we're just not using it. It's under-enforced.
Right.
So yes, the future enforcement of these new tools is going to be critical in terms of how we continue to police and evaluate and kind of look at the economy. But it can absolutely, these new tools can be complemented and supported and enhanced by other orders of government, other ministries. We see the Bureau starting to partner up through something called the Digital Regulators Forum, which of course I get excited about for its potential, partnering with the Privacy Commissioner, partnering with the CRTC. Now I believe they have a copyright element so that they can start to tackle more transversal questions that don't necessarily fit neatly into any one of their domains, just like these companies don't really fit nicely into the statistical codes that we use to characterize them.
The other thing that I wanted to ask is, because we've covered so far, how to encourage competition with new players in a sector. We've talked about how to prevent mergers that may create these situations. What about undoing them? I mean, the one everybody wants to talk about is Loblaw, obviously, but you mentioned TELUS, these companies that morph and evolve and eat up the rest of sectors and move into other sectors. Is there any chance of that happening? Is there any point in pursuing something like that, or this is what we got to live with now?
I mean, Denise has done some work on this in terms of also being backwards looking. Companies do break themselves up all the time, right? Voluntarily. Divestiture is a remedy that already exists under the Competition Act. And sometimes part of a merger going forward has been that certain elements of a company sort of have to shift and move. Typically, these breakup conversations are in the context of the largest technology firms that have this massive global power.
Right.
And if something like that were to occur, there would naturally be spillover effects to Canada. But you're right, it's different to kind of look at comparatively so much smaller in terms of scope companies in Canada. I don't know that we're super interested in naming any particular companies just for the thought experiment and the example, because at the same time, we want to be cautious about not vilifying Canadian innovation or these new structures that can be very productive and important. But it comes back to why would we break up a company?
Right.
What is the true threat or threats of bigness?
To Vass's point, so companies do break themselves up all the time. So anywhere from 20 to 30% of all M&A activity each year is restructurings or divestitures or spinoffs or sell-offs or whatever. So this is like a routine part of capitalism. So when everybody says like, oh my gosh, breaking up a firm, it's such a radical intervention, it's nuclear, it's actually not.
It's more like we think of doing it forcibly, as opposed to like if the companies choose to do it themselves, they're obviously doing it for their own economic reasons.
Yes.
Would we choose to do that for, quote unquote, the benefit of Canadians and not the companies themselves?
Exactly. My point there is just that everyone argues, oh, it's so hard to unscramble the omelet. And the point is, I don't know, we've got some really good unscramblers. But I would also just add that there are a number of sort of what are called structural remedies. So breakups is one of them, or structural separations. And in the US, there's also historical precedent for something called quarantining, where basically they prevented a company from expanding into other sectors. There was a particular case when they broke up Bell Labs in the 50s where the antitrust agencies mandated that they actually license their patents for free. And some people argue that that paved the way for the semiconductor industry to thrive. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a structural breakup, but it could be interventions which basically break open a market so that new entrants can have a foothold where you actually increase innovation. The state is not reorganizing markets or picking winners, but what it's doing is just breaking open the possibility for other new entrants to actually come and compete. And so I think, from a competition standpoint, those are really important remedies to consider, especially when there's, a firm has been found to be acting illegally.
I guess I want to ask kind of a devil's advocate question here, which is when we've covered the grocery sector before, sometimes when we've talked about other large Canadian companies, one of the things that's come up is how challenging a country Canada can be to service coast to coast because of its vast geographical size and, diffuse population outside of a few centers. And like the argument that I have heard is that it is really hard for a new player to come in and expect to challenge a Loblaws or whoever simply because the infrastructure that is needed to deliver these services across a country like Canada is incredibly large and incredibly tough to develop, and that we actually need some of these mega corporations that do seem to have a monopoly because there's nobody there that's stepping up to do it if they're not.
Yeah, I think that there's some element of truth to that, depending on the sector that you're talking about. And this kind of national champions argument as well, because of the size and scale of Canada as a geography, but also now you need to compete in global value chains, But I think that, for one, it is true that in certain industries, economies of scale or scope absolutely exist, and those are beneficial to consumers. So in those instances, that's why you need a strong regulatory regime that makes sure that those structural advantages are not taken advantage of by, the large firms that have gotten into the position where they, maybe markets sort of tip towards those kind of structures. But then there's lots of consolidation, that happens in industries that are not either globally tradable or don't require those kind of scale and scope components. And those are really where we want people to also be paying attention to say, is it legitimate that, private equity is rolling up your local bakery or your local veterinary practice? And how much of that is actually driven by, efficiency gains, and how much of that is driven by a desire to get market control so that you can become a price maker and raise prices, And so I think those are the kind of questions that we need to consider when we're making those types of arguments.
And also, more listening, right? Listening to the firms that want to come here but can't, listening to the firms that want to grow but can't. We do have great, organizational umbrellas for these firms in places like the Council for Canadian Innovators and the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. And one of the things we've heard from suppliers sometimes that we haven't acted on is just something that seems, again, more simple than it should be, but harmonizing our labeling requirements across Canada does come up, where people say it's going to be expensive because the way Canada regulates its economies is that provinces are predominantly responsible for economic business rules. And there are slight differences that, again, have great and interesting and I'm sure nuanced and fascinating history. But it is a cost. It is a small c cost for a lot of firms that may want to come and be here. And that's something we can't change the size of Canada. We can't change our population that quickly. but we can really pay attention to what actors in the space are telling us could help them and make that part of our kind of full court press here.
So last question, like I mentioned, I'd love to hear from each of you how you think this is going. We approached this week because we've heard a drumbeat of Canada is broken for at least a year now, and we wanted to look at places in Canada where solutions can actually be found and what we could do. It sounds like from talking to both of you that things are improving in this area. What do you see coming in the next 6 months to a year, and what will show you that there is actually a fix underway here, as opposed to, like we talked about, a whole bunch of new tools that are staying in the toolbox?
If I can rag on Canada for one more second, something else that Canada's kind of bad at is championing when we're great at something, right? So when it comes to rethinking and looking ahead for Canada, Denise and I talk a lot about where are the wows? Where in history has Canada stood up to corporate power in fascinating and new ways? What makes Canada different when we are looking at benchmarking the country elsewhere? One of those elements, we tend to have a public competitor in the mix, right? That's a part of our history. That's a part of our legacy. That is thinking that we could be pulling forward as we look at how digital infrastructures evolve, right? Or how we're going to support certain policy ideas. Asking that question, right, of each other, maybe through conversations with randomly selected citizens, could help us come up with an answer of, these are our principles. Denise pointed to the boldness of finally moving away from the efficiency defense. Like, that's created an amazing opportunity in Canada. There's a values vacuum here. What's next? What's new? And that's kind of what's on the horizon for Canada to define. And it'll be a huge miss if we're unwilling to take on that work, or if we look back on these legislative interventions and kind of pop a confetti cannon and say we did it. Our kind of point is we're just getting started. That was a long non-answer.
I thought it was a good answer. I think it's really interesting that you would point out that we're not good at touting our own accomplishments, because I had to ask you about the legislative tools we've just created in this interview, because I don't think many Canadians know that this is a policy area that we're actually actively working on while everybody else is making jokes about 3 grocery companies in a trench coat.
And that it's unanimous across Parliament.
Yeah, I was not expecting that.
Yeah, what areas do you find that kind of consensus, right? And I think that's what makes this policy file so special, is that you have Conservative MPs, you have NDP, all kinds of folks who may not always have the same motivations, but see a common solution in better structuring markets so that they're more pre-distributive of economic gains. That's something that we talk a lot about, and that my friend Delilah Rothenberg really brought to my attention, which is we tend to talk a lot about redistribution in Canada. We're going to tax and then redistribute wealth, and that's how we tackle inequality. But what you can also do is structure markets so that they're fairer from the beginning, and that those economic gains flow to more the everyday person. So you're not transferring a little bit of your paycheck every time you pay for something to a monopolist, or not having to bargain against a monopolist or oligopolist for a higher wage. And those structural fixes, they take a long time. It's not going to happen in 6 to 12 months. It's an attitude. It's an attitude about the reality that markets need governance, that they're not just these esoteric beings that are somehow self-regulating, that they have rules, and those rules can be set by dominant corporations, or they can be set democratically through our public channels and institutions. And so that one attitude shift I already see happening, and I think is really profound. And then practically on my mood board, I'd love to see the Bureau actually bring a merger block case and succeed under the tribunal. I'd like to see some Canadian version of what we saw in the US under the Biden administration with the executive order on competition, which established a White House Competition Council with the heads of all, most of the major agencies to actually think constructively about this and take action in a number of very practical ways. And we'd like to see competition policy get more democratized, so bringing more voices into the policymaking process where appropriate, and taking it out of the hands of sort of highly paid economists and lawyers, which have really dominated this policy file for the last 40 years. So those are a couple things on the mood board, and I think those are very doable within the next 6 to 12 months.
So great to end these conversations on a hopeful note. So thank you both for that, and thank you for your time. And I can't wait to read The Big Fix. We will put a link to it in the show notes if anybody in the audience wants to pre-order it. And thank you guys again for your time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jordan.
Vas Bednar and Denise Hearn, the co-authors of The Big Fix, How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. You can pre-order it now. You can read it October 15th. That was The Big Story. And all this week, we'll be trying to fix Canada with the help of some of the most knowledgeable people in their respective fields. If you want to offer us some feedback on this week or any other week of The Big Story, or suggest a themed week you'd like to hear from us, you can do it by writing to us, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can call us and leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in every podcast player, and on your smart speaker, just ask it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.